Was Salman Abedi a witting suicide bomber, or a suicide bomber at all? Where were his remains found? Who facilitated and made the sophisticated explosive device he's alleged to have used? And what is the security state's true relationship with Libyan extremists? Ahead of the Manchester bombing inquests, we ask some important questions.
It's the Wide Shut Webcast.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Wide Shut Webcast. I'm your host Keelan Balderson and the website is wideshut.co.uk. According to investigators, Salman Abedi, a 22-year-old Libyan raised in Britain, attacked innocent concert goers at the Manchester Arena back in May in a devastating suicide bombing. He was radicalised online, learned to make bombs from a YouTube video, and mostly acted alone. And although DNA evidence places him at the scene, exactly how and why the attack took place has yet to be determined. Although I've done some articles on the subject and been on Piers Redmond's Porkins Policy radio show a couple of times, I wanted to give Wide Shut listeners a succinct overview of where we currently are before the inquests pick back up again. So what are investigators saying? Is what they say actually supported by the evidence that's available? And therefore, what really needs to come out in the inquests to make this all make sense? 22 innocent people obviously died as a result of this bombing. Normal people just looking to enjoy a pop concert. So it's important we fully understand what happened and are 100% certain that the truth is being told. Now, for those that don't know, a coroner's inquest is supposed to take place whenever somebody dies from unnatural causes, and it's used to explain how the death occurred, with a verdict such as accidental death or unlawful killing. That's what Manchester will be. There's only a handful of verdicts that can be made. But it's the who, what, when, where and how, the technical facts surrounding the deaths, i.e. X person died at this time with these injuries from this type of blast. What's important to remember is that Salman Abedi isn't on trial here. It's not a criminal trial. There's no jury, there's no cross-examination of the evidence, no prosecution, no defence. And if the victim family members are not inclined to use their right to ask questions and they don't think there's anything that needs clearing up, then there's no obligation for the coroner to challenge investigators and to challenge the evidence that's been presented in any real way. Now, I do believe there are some questions that need to be asked, and that's what we're going to do today. We're going to go through some questions that investigators and the coroner should be asking. And they may flesh all this out. There are two inquests, one into the 22 victim deaths and a separate one into the death of Abedi, which will probably be the most interesting one. And a lot of evidence and information could come out. But as we've seen in the past with the London bombings, regardless of what does or doesn't come out, or regardless of how contradictory and poor the evidence actually is for the story being told, or if family members have concerns and do have questions that they want to ask, as they did with the 7/7 bombings, the state can essentially just conclude what they want to. They're not obligated to really answer those concerns. So if there are concerns and unanswered questions following the Manchester inquests, it may be left to the public to continue the investigation and the analysis themselves. And in my mind, the most important, most obvious, fundamental question with Manchester is, was Abedi really a suicide bomber, a witting suicide bomber? And what evidence is there to support that hypothesis? How did investigators come to the conclusion that this attack was a suicide bombing? And to explore this, I want you to ponder a couple of things. Do terrorists buy tinned tuna hours before their suicide? Salman Abedi did, according to CCTV from a Tesco. He also bought a packet of almonds, scouring pads, a bunch of mundane cleaning products. Apart from having a really rubbish final meal, why would he bother doing the cleaning? Well, let's just tease this out with some logic. If he was trying to get away with a crime, then yeah, cleaning his flat of bomb materials and residues left behind and fingerprints and whatever does make sense. But suicide bombers aren't trying to get away with a crime. They aren't trying to cover their tracks. They're dead. Or they're about to commit suicide. What happens after their death is irrelevant. They're not going on the run. And of course, if you follow the official accounts of many of these kinds of attacks, the attackers often want to be identified. Attacks are carried out for a reason. They're supposed to be political, religious. There's an ideological statement being made. Look at me. This is what I did. This is why I did it. They're trying to make a point. They want to live on in infamy. Nobody wants to die in vain. They're trying to be a martyr for a cause. And again, as we've seen throughout the modern history of Islamic terrorism in the West, suicide bombers take their bank cards and credit cards to the attacks, we're told, for the express purpose of allowing themselves to be easily identified. So we have this behaviour prior to the Manchester attack that doesn't make sense. If you're about to kill yourself, you're not worried about cleaning the oven. You're also not worried about cleaning the mess you've made while making a bomb, because you want to be identified and you think you're going to heaven to have fun with virgins. Now, according to investigators, he did actually bring a bank card to the scene. But to flip it around and test their logic, think about it. Who else might bring a bank card to the scene of an explosion? Somebody who didn't know they were about to die. Somebody who didn't know they were about to die might also go shopping to buy tuna and almonds. They might also buy cleaning products and do some mundane cleaning in their flat. And I've flipped the perspective here because evidence leaked to the New York Times, photos leaked to the New York Times, revealed that the explosive device used in Manchester and recovered was expertly made and had remote detonation capabilities. It could be set off from afar. You didn't have to set it off from within a bag or rucksack right there. You could set it off from a distance, or at least several feet away. Now, if that's the case, why would a suicide bomber need such a sophisticated device? Why would they need remote detonation capabilities? Why would they want to set it off from a distance if they planned to die? And perhaps the most important question then is, how did investigators come to the conclusion that it was a suicide bombing and Abaidi was the one that actually pressed the button? When these photos were leaked, the media speculated that the remote detonation could have been used to ensure the bomb went off if it initially failed, so there was a failsafe, or if Abaidi got cold feet, that there was this wider network that wanted to ensure the attack took place, so if Abaidi at the last minute decided, oh no, I'm not going to do this, they would push the button anyway. There's some logic there. But of course we're told that Abaidi mostly acted alone and there wasn't this wider network controlling him. Lots of contradictory information. But in light of those contradictions and that reasonable speculation, did he even know he was carrying a bomb? Or if he did, that he was going to die in the bombing? Where were Abaidi's remains found and what condition were they in? Evidence that could go towards proving the suicide bomber theory would be a record of exactly where Abaidi's remains were discovered following the explosion and the condition that they were actually in. However, this hasn't been officially disclosed and there's a lot of confusion based on what has been made available through third-party channels. Press diagrams, which were based on intelligence leaks to the New York Times, positioned Abaidi the other side of the inner arena entrance doors, which is beyond the foyer and into the main part of the arena, where everybody goes to sit down. That's where he's labelled in several diagrams printed by the media, and you can view these on the website. Now, looking at these diagrams, I'm not saying it would be impossible for him to land inside the arena. Obviously I'm not a bomb expert, but it does on the face of it seem like an odd location when he was in a crowd of people in the foyer. You have to account for him not being blocked by anyone else, or if the blast was that powerful, you have to account for why no one else ended up beside him. And just the awkwardness of being able to fly through a set of doors without the doors or the door frame or anyone near the doors or coming through the doors stopping that trajectory. So we need an explanation for that diagram. Then a new diagram was entered during the opening of the victims' inquest, and this gave an official account of where all the victims ended up. So it labelled every single person that died and where they were inside the foyer. But this time Abaidi was not included. So as it stands, there is no official account of where his remains were found, and no further insight into the accuracy of the original diagram that came out through the New York Times, which was based on leaks from the intelligence services. Did reporters just make it up? Or if it was accurate, at least at that time, why do investigators no longer support it? Why has Abaidi been scrubbed from the diagram? It's a gruesome process, but it's a fairly simple and routine process. He ended up where he ended up. It shouldn't be that difficult. On top of that confusion, there's also this strange testimony from a former military police staff sergeant called Darren Costa. He was at the scene to collect his son, and he told the press that he, quote, immediately guessed it was a suicide bombing. How does somebody immediately guess that an incident like this was a suicide bombing? Maybe a bombing, you see the smoke, debris, injured people, but a suicide bombing seems a bit weird. But not just that, he claims to have quickly identified who the suicide bomber was. Remember, this is a foyer with lots of people in, dead people, limbless people. How did he manage to immediately locate the suicide bomber in the middle of all that carnage? How did he conclude it was a suicide bombing? Or is this just something he said after the fact? I don't want to call the guy a liar. Maybe he did identify a suicide bomber, maybe he didn't. But just because he thinks or says that's what he did, doesn't actually mean he did. I want to know whether investigators support his testimony and whether the evidence supports his testimony. So far, this is just something said in a newspaper. And even more bizarre, this is what Darren Costa goes on to say. He, quote, tried to close the doors because he could, quote, see the suicide bomber's body, which was halfway inside the doors, and he didn't want anyone seeing that. There's some problems with the logic there, because there was all sorts of blood and gore in the area. Why is this one body something he doesn't want people to see? Why do people need protecting from those remains and not all the other gory remains? Secondly, if he's talking about the location of Abaidi's body as shown in the press diagrams, those doors led to the inner arena where hundreds of other people would be leaving. So closing those doors is not really hiding the gore from anyone. It's a well-trafficked area. Could he be talking about a different set of doors? A different set of remains? And again, he eventually, quote, closed the doors. So we also have to beg the question, is he tampering with a crime scene? If the body was halfway through the doors and he then closed the doors, that would mean he had to move the body. Does that perhaps explain the odd location in the diagrams? Were the remains actually moved beyond the doors, and that's why they ended up in that odd location? And regardless of what exactly he's talking about, you don't want to mess with the scene of a crime or try to conceal things before the investigators have done their job. I'm just very confused by this guy's account. The condition of Abaidi's remains is also not clear. Darren Costa recalls seeing, quote, half of his body and also, quote, a torso, and the authorities say Abaidi was identified by teeth and fingerprints and DNA. At the inquest opening, they used the vague phrase severely disrupted to describe his body. So the inquest really needs to clear all this up, because as of now, there really isn't anything concrete to suggest Abaidi was actually a suicide bomber. Where was he found? Who found the remains? What was actually found? What was the recovery process? Had things been moved? How were these conclusions made? And a piece of evidence that could help clarify a lot of this is CCTV. And interestingly, the diagram entered at the opening of the victims' inquest has a CCTV camera labelled in the foyer, up in the corner looking down towards where the bombing is supposed to have taken place. So in theory, we should be able to see where the bomber was standing, where the bomb was, and what happened in the aftermath. Whether it was recording or not, whether the blast somehow disrupted it in some way, and whether investigators actually have a copy and have used this CCTV as part of their investigation, we don't know yet. Who facilitated and made the bomb? At the end of May, Detective Chief Superintendent Russ Jackson said that their inquiry showed Abedi himself made most of the purchases of the core bomb components, and what is becoming apparent is that many of his movements and actions have been carried out alone. The lone wolf narrative. Okay, but Salman's younger brother Hashim was then arrested in Libya and said he was the one who bought all of the bomb components. And he's now actually on trial in Libya without being handed over to the Brits. There was talk of him being interviewed, but that doesn't seem to have happened. And he's now being tried for his role in the bombing, for his role in facilitating the components of the bomb. So which is it? What is the actual evidence to support either scenario? How could Russ Jackson confidently say Salman developed the bomb alone if it was Hashim? Was it Hashim? Why are there contradictions? The evidence is the evidence. They either have it or they don't, and if they don't, why promote a narrative to the media? But what I think's more important is, did Abedi even have the capabilities to build such a sophisticated device by himself? And if so, how did he gain those skills? This was a college dropout. He never studied anything practical like engineering. So surely that suggests there must have been a wider network involved that helped in the making of this bomb, or helped in the training of Abedi in bomb making. Now, the Mail tried to fill in this gap. They allowed the leaders of the Tripoli Revolutionary Brigade to accuse Abedi's father Ramadan of training his son Abedi in bomb making. And they say it took place at this compound in Tripoli where the Revolutionary Brigade only recently took over. There was a firefight, and this group took the facility from a faction that the Abedis were tacitly associated with. They were an offshoot of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which we'll get to. But despite their claims, there isn't actually any evidence provided for Salman's presence at this compound. The source is quoted as saying, "It seems inevitable to us that Ramadan Abedi would bring his son here to train him." Fine, but nobody actually claims to have seen him. They just claim to assume that's what would have happened. And you have to realise that it would be in this group's best interest to point the finger at their enemies, at this other group, because they're the ones that want to work closer with NATO and the international community. Of course, they're going to say things that benefit them and tell people what they want to hear. The actual proof for this explosives training is completely lacking. The source also says, "We don't know of many fathers who teach their sons to make bombs." The implication obviously being that Ramadan Abedi is a particularly extreme individual, and that's what he actually did. But I think the point actually stands. Why would a father who has spent a lot of time in the West, who had ties to British intelligence services, as we'll get to, who has mainly spent his time in opposition to Gaddafi, not carrying out Islamic terrorist attacks on the West, not really fighting a jihad, but just working as a militia against Gaddafi, why would he suddenly decide to sacrifice his eldest son in a suicide bombing in Manchester? We don't know many fathers who would do that. It doesn't really make much sense. So that's the Mail's theory, which is pretty baseless and I would argue pretty unlikely. Then there's this counter-terrorism think tank called Quilliam, who claim that Abedi was radicalised and learned to make explosives online by himself. So nothing to do with any trips to Libya, nothing to do with any ties to ISIS in Syria, nothing to do with extremists living in Manchester. He just taught himself online. They say, quote, 2 days after the Manchester attack, a series of bomb-making guides were found freely available on Facebook and YouTube. A 22-minute video from a series called Jihadi Ideas for Lone Lions told viewers how to make a household bomb from the same type of explosives used by Abedi. Of course, the question isn't, are there bomb making guides online? Of course there are. The question is, did Abedi access those guides? And Quilliam don't actually clarify this. So if the Inquest explores this topic, which it should, since this is supposed to have come from intelligence sources, they need to submit his browser history. They would need to submit the technical data that directly links Abedi to the video. That's how you prove Abedi learned to make bombs on YouTube. If not, it's just speculation. It certainly fits with Theresa May's internet spying agenda, but it doesn't mean it's true. And even if he did actually access this video, it also doesn't prove that that's the only way he learned to make bombs. So I'm not sure that that narrative really holds up to scrutiny. Quilliam also say that these guides were for making TATP explosives, and that's what Abedi used in the explosion in Manchester, triacetone triperoxide, this concoction. However, as researcher Tom Secker pointed out in a Facebook post, TATP doesn't produce flashes or flames or heat. It's not an exothermic explosive. So if that's what was used, it seems to go against the various eyewitness accounts of flashes and burning and the typical experience of a bombing. TATP is also highly volatile and prone to accidental detonation. It's a very dangerous mix. So is it really the substance for somebody to be playing around with based on a YouTube guide? And I'd argue that it would be pretty difficult to learn how to make such a sophisticated bomb solely from a YouTube video. Perhaps a combination of hands-on training and online training would make sense, but they seem to like to push this absolutist narrative when there's no conclusive proof and it doesn't really make logical sense. Just teaching yourself bomb making from a YouTube video, I don't buy it. And I mean, without a wider network or prior explosives training, how does one go about testing bombs in a residential area without getting caught? You can't just build a sophisticated device like this in one attempt and then be certain that it will go off without carrying out tests beforehand. Surely you'd have to do it a few times, maybe make a few weaker versions of the device and then set them off to make sure that you've got it all right, to make sure that you know what you're doing. And how does one do that? Did he rent an industrial warehouse out the way where nobody would notice anything? Did he somehow get away with doing this in a flat, in a house? Or, as makes the most logical sense, was there actually a wider network, and did he actually learn to do this in Libya or somewhere else overseas? And if so, why are the Brits so insistent that he acted alone and learned this from YouTube? Are they hiding something else? Which brings us to our final pre-inquest question. What was the state's true relationship with the Abedis and Libyan extremists? We know that Salman Abedi grew up in a Libyan community in Manchester, and his father and neighbours, including Al-Qaeda bomb expert Abdel Basset Azouz, were members of an anti-Gaddafi militia called the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. We know that in the 90s, the British security state, particularly MI6, supported the LIFG's terrorism against Gaddafi and even facilitated an assassination attempt against him. We know that the state gave LIFG members refuge in Manchester, including the Abedi family. So if Salman Abedi was an extremist who carried out the attack in the manner that they say, we might then have to consider blowback, in the sense that the state fostered these extremists and appeased them because they were useful pawns in foreign policy. But it goes much further than that. The Middle East Eye covered this quite well. They tracked down a bunch of these exiled Libyans in Manchester and around the UK, and they said quite clearly that the control orders, these special measures that mean they're closely monitored by the security services and police and are banned from travelling, these control orders were actually lifted in 2011 so they could travel freely to Libya and fight the conflict against Gaddafi. In fact, one guy says he actually got stopped at the airport by the authorities, and all he had to do was hand over the phone number of his MI5 handler, and he was whisked through, no questions asked. Some of these people didn't even have passports. They were just waved on through to fight the West's dirty war in Libya. And numerous sources, Abedi's school friends, the Libyan authorities themselves, have all come out and said that Salman, as well as his father and younger brother Hashim, had all travelled to Libya in 2011 under this NATO operation. Al-Basit Azouz was with them, the so-called Al-Qaeda bomb expert. They were all part of this complete mess that NATO caused in Libya. And interestingly, Theresa May was Home Secretary at the time that all of this was going on. So maybe we have a motive for why investigators seem so keen on downplaying the idea of a wider network and other influences on this attack, and why they're so keen to claim Abedi was self-radicalised on the internet, because to say otherwise would be to implicate the government itself, wouldn't it? Then of course we also have the claim that the FBI had been investigating Abedi since 2016 and tipped off MI5 in early 2017 that he was planning to assassinate a political figure or attack a political target of some kind in this country. They knew who this guy was. And this idea that there were 20,000 jihadis to monitor, and that means MI5 and co couldn't keep track of him and he innocently fell through the cracks, it's absurd because it ignores the context of what the security and intelligence services were actually doing and weren't doing. If he was part of a specific Libyan cell, was allowed to freely travel to Libya, and MI5 may have been tipped off about his radicalisation and plans to carry out an attack, then the idea that MI5 were just overworked and they didn't have much info on this guy and he was lost in the sea of people is irrelevant, because that's just not true, is it? If he wasn't being monitored, they made a conscious decision not to monitor him. And that, at the very least, is criminal negligence, presuming he was actually a willing suicide bomber in the first place. Also, what was the result of MI5's 2 internal inquiries into what they knew and whether they could have prevented the attack? Or does the fact that they were internal inquiries mean we don't actually get to know, and therefore it was all completely pointless? And do we really trust them to investigate themselves anyway? Whenever these sorts of attacks happen, they always float the idea that they need more resources and more powers, and they never accept any actual responsibility for the things they were doing. Even Jeremy Corbyn, a staunch critic of the security state, did a complete 180 after Manchester and essentially pledged his full support and said he was willing to give as much funding as they wanted. So you ask, what was the state's true relationship with the Abedis and Libyan extremists? I'm not the only one that's connecting some dots there. And I point you to the Associated Press interview with the father, Ramadan Abedi, which for some reason has been removed from a lot of the news sites. Obviously the Associated Press kind of syndicates its articles out through the mainstream media, and a lot of mainstream media sites have since removed the article, and only a handful now have it. But this is what Father Abedi said. We don't believe in killing innocents. This is not us. We aren't the ones who blow up ourselves among innocents. My message to the world is that there are hidden hands that want to tarnish the image of Muslims who live in the West. And within hours of that interview, Ramadan Abedi was arrested in Libya, along with the younger brother Hashim. Of course, if he knew his son did this, and it did play out in much the way investigators claim, and he even helped train him, then obviously he is gonna have a reason to spin the blame elsewhere. But in light of Salman's unlikely actions prior to the attack, as we discussed at the start, in light of the contradictions surrounding where his body was found and the condition that it was in, the unlikelihood that he could have even made the device all by himself and just by following a YouTube video, and this clear relationship between the state and the Libyan extremists, it's not that crazy to think there might be something more to this story, that something's being covered up to some degree. Nobody can say for certainty what happened, we can have suspicions, but the narrative, often conflicting, that is filtered out through the media from the intelligence services and the investigators themselves doesn't add up. the evidence isn't there. Things they say doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence that they claim exists. So now we await the inquests to see what evidence does come out, to see what does get clarified, to see whether investigators are vindicated, or we end up with even more questions to ask about what happened. I'm not 100% sure when the inquests are supposed to recommence. I think the last time I checked they said October, November. Basically, it rests on the ongoing investigation. But I think they're aiming for this to carry on before the end of the year. So keep it locked here on wideshut.co.uk. I've been your host, Keelan Balderson, and I'll try to follow the inquest as best I can when they recommence, and expect more articles and podcasts to go along with that.